Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another edition of Film Fanatic. Always love to start things off, especially when we have some new folks that have jumped on board and have joined this fun, crazy little ride that I call Film Fanatic. Welcome to the fold with some bunch of new subscribers just within the last few days, so it's very cool. And again, it's been awesome because people have been commenting more in the videos, and it's very cool. So I try to, always trying to bring a lot of focus on movies that I have just discovered for the first time. I did a show yesterday on this really awesome movie that I just discovered for the very first time. Bought it on a whim, and that was this movie starring Hal Holbrook, one of my favorite kind of character actors from like the '60s and '70s. He was two of my favorite roles of his and I think two of my favorite roles of his career, and they also I think show how versatile he was as an actor, and truly a chameleon. All the President's Men with Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman, amazing movie, one of my favorite movies of all time. Hal Holbrook plays the mysterious character known as Deep Throat, who is kind of like a somewhat an informant, a person who was part of the scandal, and of course it's about Watergate. But he's amazing in that movie. His whole character is just adds so much suspense to that story and to that movie. One of my favorite movies of all time. And then one of my other favorite roles of his was in John Carpenter's The Fog, one of my favorite Carpenter movies. He plays a priest that uncovers the murderous conspiracies and the murderous happenings that happened that caused that brought about the horrific nature of that movie. And he plays a priest in that movie that uncovers the dark, the secrets of the town. Such a cool movie, one of the best horror movies I think ever. One of my favorite Carpenter movies. But those two movies, I think in particular, really show how wonderful he was as an actor, and how diverse he could be, and how he was. He was in numerous roles throughout his career. And the newest one, even though it's from like 1977, that I discovered, Rituals, where he's like a leading man. And he kind of plays a different role in that kind of a movie, a very different role, where he's almost like an action star. But that movie is, I definitely consider it to be this, ultra low budget guerrilla style kind of exploitation movie, and it's kind of an extraordinary movie. I kind of think of it as when I was watching it, and then there's some really great special features on the and I have a Blu-ray copy of it, but there's a really cool special features component. And during some of these interviews, they talk about how Deliverance had just come out, and Deliverance was, of course, directed by John Borman, starring Burt Reynolds and Ned Beatty. An amazing movie, one of my favorites from the '70s. And that movie had just come out, and Rituals was very much, I definitely would say, it was very much influenced by Deliverance. And I think it definitely tried to capitalize on that movie's success in kind of your typical exploitation factor. This movie had like zero budget, and the all of the hardships that they went through with that, with rituals of shooting it. Where they would do a lot of these things, a lot of the sequences and stunts in the movie in one take, and they were really, the actors involved in that movie were risking life and limb during the filming of that movie. But it's an interesting movie because it's like when I bought it, when I looked at the cover, it billed it as this like kind of classic slasher movie, and slasher movies are my favorite. And it's really interesting because in the special features, and then I was feeling it when I was watching it, is it's kind of this weird version, a combination of Deliverance meets classic, 70s, 80s slasher kind of aesthetic, and it's very cool, and it also has a little bit of like a supernatural element, and the killer in the movie kind of almost takes on this thing of where you don't really know exactly who this person is that's stalking these guys and these men. You don't really know what his motivation is until kind of towards the end, and then you almost feel like maybe he's not really like a mortal person. He's almost like this mystical, supernatural kind of a presence, and he's almost like a force of evil as opposed to just this crazed man. So it has a little bit of a supernatural element to it, which is really cool, and it really makes it really sets it apart story wise from Deliverance, and so it's very different in that regard. But very cool movie. And so again, that's from another movie from my favorite decade of all time, which is the '70s. And so a lot of the reviews and shows I've been doing have been on movies I just discovered for the first time. So very, very cool. And I kind of continue. I will probably definitely continue that kind of tradition of how I do those movies, and just overall how I do these reviews, because the majority of them are in that uh, in that kind of way of presenting these videos. But today's show is on another classic movie. I think it's an example of like classic American cinema, and it's a movie that again I've seen so many times. It's part of this really great franchise. I've done coverage of quite a few franchises on this channel. The first one I ever did, which was the biggest one I've ever done, and I haven't really covered anything as extensively, but that is the Friday the 13th franchise. My favorite movie franchise of all time, and definitely my favorite horror franchise of all time. Last year I did a big series of shows and videos of where I covered all of the movies. And that was really great. And I watched all of the movies in succession. I did a show on the Halloween franchise. I also did a show on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise. I also did a show on the Psycho franchise, which was kind of weird because I didn't realize I had seen all of the other movies, but when I was doing that show, originally it was Psycho, I had this craving of like, oh wait, there are all of these other movies, and I had not seen them in a long time. So during that time, I rented from Opera House Video, the video shop that I go to in Belfast. I rented the other ones, and I had not seen them in a very, very long time. So I watched all of those movies in succession, and that was very cool. And I really got an interesting, uh, a very different perspective than I remember it being in the past. So I covered all those movies, and that was a very cool experience. And this is kind of the same, more or less the same kind of thing, because there are many movies, but today's movie is going to be about Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry. And also, when I was thinking of a movie to do this morning, and I grabbed this out of my pile of films, I forgot that this movie, how old this movie is, and that it's from 1971, which is wild. But what an extraordinary movie! I have not seen this movie in quite a while, but again, I have a really good deluxe edition of this film on DVD, and of course, it stars the iconic Clint Eastwood. I think one of his best roles ever. His career as a figure in Hollywood is just incredibly massive. I was introduced, like millions of other people, to Clint Eastwood's career through Sergio Leone, the great master Italian director, in all of the westerns that, all the classic spaghetti westerns that he was a part of. Those, as a kid, were the movies that made me become aware of Clint Eastwood. And then he eventually started making more and more American movies, and I feel like these movies really put him on the map as a leading man and as a leading actor. And I think that this Dirty Harry, especially the original, it's super brutal. It's super raw, and and I really think that it's a movie that probably could not really be made today in today's kind of social climate, because it's not like, by any of today's kind of standards, it would be deemed not politically correct. He's essentially plays a cop who takes the law in his own hands, and it's not politically correct in any way. It's super brutal. The interesting thing too about this movie is this movie came out during the time when San Francisco, and of course this movie was directed by Don Siegel, and it's hard to believe that this came out in 71. Don Siegel was a pretty famous American film director and television and producer. He was involved with so many movies. The Dirty Harry series. He directed this very film, Dirty Harry, in 1971. Escape from Alcatraz in 79, another fantastic movie. He also directed the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is this classic, 1956, which is, easily one of the best and one of my favorite stories and movies in the science fiction horror realm. When it comes to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the original is fantastic. I mean, it's a classic. But I really love the one in the late '70s that came out with Donald Sutherland. That movie is just, oh God, I just love that movie. That's one of my all-time favorites. He also directed The Beguiled, another Clint Eastwood movie in 1971 that came out in the same year. Two Mules for Sister Sarah in 1970. Charlie Varick. Coogan's Bluff, another Western. Pretty prolific director and figure in Hollywood, Don Siegel. The Shootist in 76. Just, he was also involved with The Killers, 1964. Flaming Star, Play Misty for Me, another amazing movie. So many great movies he was involved in. The interesting thing too about Dirty Harry was that the story and the premise of the movies basically kind of centered on the Zodiac killer. When the Zodiac, the notorious serial killer in San Francisco, basically held California and San Francisco in this siege of fear, and he was responsible for multiple murders in San Francisco and in California at the time, and it went on for the span of 15 to 20 years, and it never was resolved. They never actually caught who the Zodiac was, and that story, that time period, played a key role in the inspiration for Dirty Harry. And it's interesting because one of my favorite movies from David Fincher, The Zodiac, of course, about the Zodiac killings, which follows that whole story over the span of like 20 to 30 years, which is just an extraordinary movie. I think one of the best David Fincher movies. But there's a really interesting thing that happens in that movie where there's a sequence where the police officers involved in that story are out. They go to the case has been going on for years, and they still cannot, they still don't know, they still haven't had, don't really have any suspects. Everyone is getting extremely frustrated. And there's a sequence of where one of the head detectives goes to the movies to see Dirty Harry, and he realizes, wow, this movie is totally, making taking this story of what he's going through and what the country's going through, and kind of sensationalizing it a little bit, but making it was basically modeled off of that, particularly around the killer in Dirty Harry. And at one point he like walks out of the theater because he gets really pissed off and kind of hurt by it. Very interesting. And I kind of feel like, you know, it was one of the first movies of the time that kind of made a movie, kind of straight or ripped from the headlines of the time, particularly around the age and the time, even, well, especially now around the time of where you take these sensationalized stories, but then also true crime stories. You know, just recently, the last couple of years, there was a Netflix series, which I haven't seen, which is about Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, the notorious serial killer in LA. And there was a series that came out, I think it was last year or the year before, all about that story. And I've heard it was pretty good, but I have not seen it. And it dove pretty deep into the whole history of that really dark period. And then I know just recently there was another Netflix series about Jeffrey Dahmer, and there was a movie that came out a few years ago also based off of that really terrifying period. And one of my favorite movies about, say, true crime, if you want to call it that, or based on a true life serial killer, is Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, and that movie is about Henry Lee Lucas. So, and I've talked about that too, where I think there's a fine line, because true crime is this massive, massive genre, and I think there is, as a fan, and it's hard to say, like, or using the word fan, but I've always been fascinated by what could motivate somebody to such horrible acts, and the psychology that entails. I feel like obviously people are products of their environment, and also when you tie in the mental health of what the government can provide for people, and then also just the state of what a person will take, a proactive kind of self-realization as to where they are psychologically, and if they seek out help. A lot of times people don't, but and we see those traits of what makes up someone who is a psychopath or a psychotic person and has these tendencies to have this incredible is incredibly antisocial to a degree. And so the psychology around true crime and what makes a serial killer has always been super fascinating. And how, in a lot of ways, we're really removed. We all have those traits in us to a degree. But if you change the variables and the situation, people are almost anybody and everybody is capable of some of those horrendous acts. But there's also in our culture there's like a fascination with it where it can be this thing of where it can almost take on this weird kind of frightening thing of where people can almost become fanboys of serial killers. I know somebody who I play music with, and he worked with somebody who was really into true crime, and he actually had posters of serial killers in his apartment. He had poster. He would tell me that he would like go over his apartment, and he would have like posters hanging up of like Richard Ramirez, which to me is a whole other level of where you're actually a fan. Like they become rock stars to you, and that's pretty disturbing. I think it's a kind of crossing a line. I know a woman who is really into the true crime thing, and she actually has tattoos of the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, on her arm, and she uh, has complete empathy and basically believes that he was in the right. And doing research and seeing on how he was more or less created, the government more or less did kind of create this guy, and he was, you do have empathy towards him, but at the end of the day, he was a psychopath. He did hurt innocent people, and so there's a fine line. There's a fine line of how a person should view that. And I think the Dirty Harry movie was one of the first movies that took that kind of idea of more or less a true crime scenario, true life serial killer that was in reality a real life monster, and they were making a film based off of that, or a franchise. So very fascinating. It was kind of one of the first of its time. One of the first movies that I'm aware of that really kind of dove into that whole world. But the cast, of course, for Dirty Harry is just incredible. Clint Eastwood, obviously, is the star. Andrew Robinson played the Scorpio, who is basically modeled off of the Zodiac. William Peterson, no, and William Peterson was not in that. John Vernon, uh, and Harry Gardino. But fantastic movie, and this this movie kind of ushered in the there's quite a few movies in the franchise, and it kind of ushered in also one of the first kind of franchise movies that ever kind of came about to Hollywood and to the American public. The music is just incredible. Again, it's one of the movies that is, you know, an example or reason why the '70s, is still my favorite decade and will probably always be. I find myself always watching movies from the '70s, and always and then movies that I've seen that I love. I always kind of go back to that period and watch tons of movies that came out during that time, especially in the super low budget exploitation world. This movie was a huge commercial hit when it came out. It was a big blockbuster when it came out, and it really established as Clint Eastwood. I mean, he's gone on after making all kinds of films. He also was also a pretty, or well, he's still making movies, but he has a huge career as a director also and a writer. Play Misty for Me is a pretty incredible movie. He's won the Academy Award quite a few times for like The Unforgiven, which is one of my favorite westerns, if not my favorite western. I just love that movie to death. He won numerous awards. Another movie, Million Dollar Baby, which was another movie that came out after that he won a bunch of Academy Awards for. So he went on, aside from acting and producing, he went on to become a pretty serious force of nature in the world of directing. So a pretty iconic figure in all of Hollywood. My favorite periods of Clint Eastwood was, obviously some of those movies that he directed. Another movie of his that I really, really love that I think is really underrated is a film called Absolute Power that he directed with Gene Hackman. Just an amazing thriller. So awesome. I really want to see that movie again and buy that eventually. Pretty underrated. Unforgiven is probably my favorite movie of his. But so many great movies that he did direct. His later part of his career, not so much, but his earlier stages, with The Unforgiven and Million Dollar Baby being probably his last few movies that were really, really just amazing. All of the incredible acting roles, and then I have to say all the films that he did in Italy with Sergio Leone are also they probably at the end of the day are my favorite. I just love those spaghetti westerns. They're just so incredible. I will eventually do some shows on some of those films because they are they're just iconic classics. So I don't own Dirty Harry. Obviously, this is a DVD copy, but it would be awesome to eventually buy these movies on Blu-ray. But this is actually a really good DVD copy. There's tons of special features. The quality is really, really great. Another reason I love this movie and movies from the 70s is the music for this movie is just so badass. Like, it's just Pimp Daddy stuff. Pimp Daddy shit is so damn good. But I love that this movie is pure 70s cinema. Like, it just transports you. It's like when you watch this movie, it's like a time machine and it brings you right back to that amazing, amazing decade. So, this is Jason Dean. Thanks again. Keep the comments coming, and we will see you next time. Peace.